So the study that we chose to replicate was from the article Increasing Physical Activity Through Self-Monitoring and Goal Setting and Feedback by Matthew P. Normand. He starts off the article, and in the beginning of the article, he talks about how 66% of adults in the United States are overweight, and that this presents risk factors for many different health problems like heart disease, types of cancer, and diabetes, and how it can also be costly because not only do you have these healthcare costs, but you also lose wages because of your missing work and stuff. And then I liked this quote that he put in there, and it was, "Weight alone is not a sufficient measure of health. Focusing directly on healthy behavior, such as increased physical activity, might prove a better approach." And so this leads to the reason for the original study, and it was to increase physical activity. So they used a multiple baseline across participants design and a reversal design. They had five participants who exercised regularly and semi-regularly, but they all wanted to increase their activity. Each day they all wore the same pedometer, and it was like the same brand and everything. It had a 7-day memory, and they recorded the number of steps taken, and this was how they measured how they increased their physical activity a day, each day. Then they also conducted reliability checks with their experimenter once a week. Most of them were face-to-face, and the experimenter would use the 7-day memory to go back and look to make sure that whatever they self-reported was actually true. The participants also sent daily emails to their experimenter, just noting their progress and doing a self-report, and then their experimenter would reply back with feedback and would encourage them and praise them, like saying, "Good job, keep it up," things like that. So then during the intervention part, the participants were able to self-monitor and look at their pedometer. During the baseline phase, they actually had a sticker over it, so they couldn't look at it at all. They also had a social validity survey that was given at the end, and they used a 5-point scale that measured the participants' level of agreement on whether they thought the intervention was useful. So the intervention of self-monitoring, feedback, and goals. The results of the original study were that each participant's step totals increased, and then they decreased when the intervention was removed. So when they returned back to that baseline phase, they actually decreased, and then when intervention was put back in, they increased again. The goals did not correlate, so each week they also had a goal that they set, and the goals did not correlate with the steps, and so it proved not to really be effective to have a goal to actually do so many steps a day. But then each participant also marked that they did agree that this intervention did work for them.
Okay, so I'm going to be going over the purpose. So basically, the purpose of this project, basically it's common in the United States to have difficulty becoming more active or losing weight. So losing weight and being active is pretty much essential to our health. In general, people try to actually cut corners and use an easy fix like diet pills, 15-minute videos, that type of stuff. And Normand's 2008 study investigates using self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback to increase that physical activity. So each member of our group actually can relate to this, which is why we thought this was a great study for us to choose. Go to the next slide. So we all had either like a personal goal that we want to lose weight or become more active. So it really did relate to us. The intervention, if the intervention is successful, it would provide us with other options to increase our physical activity instead of using like a quick fix such as a diet pill or a 15-minute, 15-minute video. And it also gives us more of an in-depth perspective of ourselves. So when we did this project, we were really able to look at our behavior and what we did and monitor ourselves, and also as well as getting feedback from our group members to keep going. And it just kind of gave us information as to what we need to change about our behavior if it did not work. So it's just it was a really good way to show us exactly what we were doing, what was happening, why we were not increasing our physical activity in a sense. So it was a really good way for us to look at our own behavior.
Now I'm going to talk about the methods. First, I'm going to talk about the behavior definition. As in the study was described, anything that's physical activity will count and be measured. In this case, will be the number of steps each individual will take during a given day, counted as a full 24-hour period. We used a pedometer. Some of us had a different device connected to the apps, to the phones, and some of us had the actual pedometer equipment. And we've used that to count the number of steps as our study progressed. The permanent product recording was what we used to measure the number of steps. And it was a permanent recording. As I said, it was something that we used the whole 24-hour period. The IOA and treatment integrity was basically each of us took a picture during the first week of the baseline on the screenshot or the pedometer count, and we will send it out to the experimenter. Each of us had to put a tape to cover the number of steps during the first week of measurement, just so that we don't see how many steps are we going, and at the end of the week we will send the whole count for each day, and the photos were sent daily to the experimenter, and that was basically the whole baseline average for each of us. I already advanced in the baseline, so that's how we took the baseline. Most of us had the online app, and after the baseline, we had just sent a screenshot or picture to the experimenter, and at the same time, we will receive the feedback from them, each of us, and so that was the incentive for us to increase the physical activity and continue with self-monitoring. During the intervention phase, that's after the first week, we remove the stickers from all the devices and the pedometers, and we logged each day data, and we send it to the experimenters so that they can continue with the feedback and encouragement. And after the intervention phase during the second week, we basically calculate the average of all the steps from the week before to see what the difference is and where we were, where the progress was heading, or if we were not making progress.
So here you can see my graph. My baseline average was 3,519 steps, and my last phase of intervention was 6,297 steps. So I increased by almost 3,000 steps from the very beginning, which I was happy about because my physical activity did increase. It's important to note too, after each of my baselines, my steps increased, and when the intervention was first removed and we went back to baseline, my steps also did decrease. And next we will hear from Ashley.
And this was my graph. So my original, when we did the baseline the first time, my average was 7,228 steps. And then the last intervention phase, it jumped all the way to 9,822 steps for my average. So, and then it did go down for the second baseline when we returned to baseline. And then I did notice like there was a lot of factors with it too, like on Saturdays and Sundays, no matter which week it was always pretty low, but it did increase overall. So it definitely helped. Yes,
I did also notice the same thing. Some days we'll have considered drop. And those were usually matching Saturdays or Sundays that, we don't do much activity. I do work out often, so the days that I go to the gym, those were, that's why my graphs look like there is a peak, and then some days, it's usually 3 days a week, which I go and it's all constant. My average on baseline was 3,085 steps per day. During the intervention phase, it went a little bit down to 2,167, and then it kind of stayed on same average, very close, and there was minimum change after the second intervention, the self-monitoring, which went up to 4,271 on average. Rachel, you're muted.
Sorry. For my first baseline, my average was at about 3,019. And my last intervention was averaged at about 4,750. My baseline was actually increased, but that was a kind of a busy week for me where I had some extra things going on that wouldn't normally be. So I think that's kind of skewed my numbers there a little bit.
Okay, so my baseline average was 3,119. I did realize the one data point that went up pretty high for the baseline was 10,340 steps. And I was with a student that day that I had to watch, and we walked around for 5 hours, which is why I had such a high peak. For the intervention phase, the average was 2,224. So compared to my baseline average, it wasn't effective. And then when we went back to baseline, it was 1,643, and my intervention was 380. Intervention average was 3,837. So it slightly increased, but not to the point of so high. So it was somewhat effective.
So next I will be talking about the conclusion of our study. My data and Ashley's data both showed an increased number of steps in both of the intervention phases compared to the previous baseline. So when Ashley and I both went back to baseline, our steps decreased and then increased again. Marcella, Rachel, and Tara did not show an increased number of steps in both of the intervention phases compared to baseline. But it should be noted that Marcella, Rachel, and Tara's data did show an increased number of steps in the last phase of the intervention compared to the initial baseline, which is a really important thing to notice, since there was 42 days in our total study. So from day 1 to day 42, it did increase. Comparing it to the original study, all participants did show an increase in number of steps during both of the intervention phases compared to 2 out of 5, so 40% in our replication of the study. We all did speak together about the goal setting, self-monitoring, and feedback, and if we believe that it did help increase our physical activity, and we did think that, and going to our data to actually prove that, it was seen in our graphs, and it did show an increased number of steps, again, in the last phase of intervention compared to the initial baseline. Next, we'll hear from Rachel about the limitations.
So some of the limitations we found in our replication of the study included the fact that areas throughout the country on different time zones. So at times it did make it difficult to get everyone together to be able to kind of meet, go over everything, and work effectively as a group. We did, of course, make attempts to ensure procedural integrity and accuracy of the data being provided, but lack of that physical proximity for all of us may have an impact on the overall data. If we were closer to each other and able to like motivate each other in person or kind of provide that checks and balances aspect, it may have had an impact on the overall data. Importance of keeping the integrity and honesty in the data reporting, but in a group without that concentrated background, the data reported may not be as accurate and may require some additional checks and balances for accuracy verification, like direct observation, as in the original study. The final limitation we found was just that because we were not all using the same device or application to count steps, that may have an impact on the overall reliability. Some did use a wearable type pedometer, others used an app on the cell phone to count steps, each of which kind of have their own pros and cons as far as consistency, keeping the device or application either on the person or open and available for an application. And the cell phone apps did have a slightly lessened reliability as well because of the possibility that the application can crash without realizing, especially during that baseline phase where we weren't checking the numbers. And so to that point, it may have had an impact on the numbers as well that we weren't aware of as far as the data not being tracked or failure to launch the application.
Yeah, stop recording.
Should I stop the recording?
Mhm.